She arrived on a train that hissed like a threat. The steam billowed onto the platform, a ghost in the brittle afternoon light, and for a moment it swallowed her whole. When it cleared, she was standing there, a single wooden trunk at her feet, her hands clasped in front of a gray wool coat. She was smaller than he had imagined from the photograph, more fragile, like a bird that had flown a very long way and forgotten the reason for its journey. Caleb Bell shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the worn leather of his boots groaning in the silence. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face weathered by sun and a grief that had settled deep into the creases around his eyes. He took off his hat, a gesture of politeness that felt clumsy and loud in the quiet air. He didn't speak much. Not anymore. Anya Volkov watched him approach. His shadow stretched long and thin, reaching her before he did. She saw the hesitation in his step, the uncertainty in the way he held his hat, twisting the brim in his large, calloused hands. Her own hands were still, her face a placid lake. Inside, a storm raged. The journey had been a blur of clattering wheels and strange, sharp-edged words she could not grasp. It had stripped away everything she was, leaving only this still point on a train platform in a country she did not know, waiting for a man whose name she had practiced saying in her head until it lost all meaning. Caleb. Caleb. It sounded like a stone dropping into a well. She did not speak, not a single word. Her voice was a room she had locked and thrown away the key to, long ago, in another life, a life of snow and birch trees and a different man's name. He reached for her trunk, his knuckles brushing against the worn wood. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but he saw it. He drew his hand back as if burned. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the wagon parked at the end of the dusty street. It was a silent invitation. She gave a small, formal nod, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She looked at everything but him. The faded paint on the general store, the horse tied to a post, the vast, pale sky that seemed to stretch into an unforgiving forever. She picked up her own trunk, the weight of it familiar, grounding. It contained all that was left of her. A few dresses, a photograph with folded corners, a single teacup wrapped in linen. He watched her, his expression unreadable, and then turned and walked toward the wagon. She followed, her steps light and soundless on the wooden planks of the platform, a shadow chasing a shadow. The ride to the homestead was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind across the plains. It was a lonely sound, a sound that spoke of emptiness. Anya held her hands in her lap, her gaze turned outward to the passing landscape. It was brown and gold and endless. Nothing like the dense, dark forests of her home, nothing like the crowded streets of the city where she had last felt a flicker of life. This was a place where a person could get lost, not in a crowd, but in the sheer scale of nothingness. Caleb sat beside her, his shoulders stiff, his hands holding the reins with a white-knuckled grip. He did not look at her. He seemed to be driving them toward the edge of the world. The house appeared slowly, a dark shape against the horizon. It was a simple wooden structure, weathered to the color of driftwood. It sagged a little to one side, as if tired of standing against the wind. Willow Bend Trail, the letter had said. But there were no willows, only a few skeletal cottonwoods with branches that clawed at the sky. As they drew closer, she could see the neglect, peeling paint, a loose shutter that banged a forlorn rhythm against the wall, a yard of packed dirt where not even weeds seemed to thrive. This was the place her life was to begin again. It felt more like a place where things came to end. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. The silence that fell was heavier than the silence of the journey. It was a settled, watchful quiet. Anya waited. He came around and stood by her side of the wagon, his hand offered to help her down. She looked at his hand, large and scarred, a farmer's hand. She hesitated, then placed her own small hand in his. His skin was rough, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. For a second, her eyes met his. His were the color of a winter sky, gray and clouded over. He looked away first. The front door opened before they reached it. A child stood in the doorway. A little girl, no more than 5, with hair the color of spun corn silk and eyes the same stormy gray as her father's. She wore a simple, faded dress and held a small, faceless doll made of rags. She did not smile. She did not move. She just stood there, a miniature sentinel guarding a fortress of sorrow. This was the child, Sadie. The letter had mentioned her. My daughter Sadie has not spoken since her mother passed. Caleb's posture softened as he looked at the girl. Sadie, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first word he had spoken directly to another person since the station. The child's expression did not change. Her gaze flickered from her father to the strange woman beside him, and then to the trunk he carried. Her eyes were old, filled with a knowledge no child should possess. Anya stopped a few feet from the porch. She looked at the little girl, and in the child's profound stillness, she saw a reflection of her own. Here was another locked room, another soul gone quiet. She did not try to smile. She did not offer a hand. She simply stood, her presence an unspoken question. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she tucked it back behind her ear. The gesture was slow, deliberate. Sadie watched it. She watched the way Anya's fingers moved, the way her coat shifted in the wind. She watched her as if she were trying to read a story written in a language she had never seen before. Caleb carried the trunk inside, the sound of his boots heavy on the wooden floors. The house swallowed him up. Anya and Sadie were left alone on the patch of barren dirt, the wind their only chaperone. Anya took a slow breath, the air thin and cold. She looked at the child's unblinking stare and gave a slow, deliberate blink in return. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. I see you. For the first time, Sadie's gaze seemed to focus on Anya's face. The child's head tilted, a minute shift, a flicker of curiosity in the deep well of her silence. Anya took one step toward the porch, then another. She walked past the child and into the house, her movements as quiet and careful as if she were entering a church. The house was cold, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a place that had been emptied of warmth, of laughter, of life. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom. The furniture was sparse and functional, a large wooden table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace that was dark and empty. A thick layer of stillness coated everything. Anya set her trunk down by the staircase. Caleb was standing by the hearth, his back to her, staring into the blackness as if he could see a fire there. He did not turn. Anya knew what she had to do. Her life, for now, was not about words. It was about actions. She took off her coat and draped it carefully over the back of a chair. She rolled up the sleeves of her simple gray dress. She went to the sink, where a pump stood like a metal crane. She worked the handle until water, rusty at first, then clear and cold, gushed into the basin. She washed her hands, the shock of the cold water a welcome sting. She found a pail and a rag under the sink. Without a word, she began to clean. She started with the table, wiping away the film of dust and neglect. She scrubbed at a dark stain until it faded to a pale ghost. Her movements were efficient, economical. The quiet sounds of her work, the slosh of water, the scrape of the rag on wood, were the first domestic noises the house had heard in a long time. Sadie had followed her inside. She stood in the doorway of the main room, her rag doll clutched to her chest, watching. Her silence was not empty. It was absorbent. It took everything in. She watched Anya move from the table to the windowsills, from the windowsills to the hearth. Anya did not look at her, but she was aware of the child's presence as if she were a second skin. It was a familiar feeling, being watched, being judged, but the child's gaze was different. It was not hostile. It was just there. a constant, questioning presence. That night, Caleb showed her to a small room upstairs. It was bare except for a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a single quilt. A small window looked out onto the endless plains. "This is yours," he said, his voice rough with disuse. He placed her trunk at the foot of the bed and left, closing the door softly behind him. Anya stood in the middle of the room for a long time. The floorboards creaked under her weight. The wind moaned at the window pane. She went to the window and looked out. A sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, a pale, lonely comma. She felt a profound and aching solitude, so vast it seemed to have its own geography. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she had given up. She opened her trunk. Inside, nestled amongst the clothes, was the teacup. It was fine porcelain, painted with delicate blue flowers, and it was cracked. A fine, dark line ran from the rim to the base. Her husband had given it to her. A small piece of beauty, he had said, to hold in your hands when the world is ugly. The cup had survived the journey from their small apartment. It had survived the news of his death. The crack had come later, a moment of carelessness in a refugee camp, a slip of the hand that mirrored the shattering of her world. She had kept the pieces. She had glued them back together with a painstaking slowness, the mended line a scar she traced with her finger every day. It was broken, but it was whole. It could still hold tea. She unwrapped it and set it on the small crate that served as a nightstand. It was the first piece of herself she had put into this house. The next day, she continued her silent work. She found the pantry sparsely stocked with flour, beans, and salt. She found a small, withered clutch of onions in a bin. She found yeast. She set about making bread. The work was familiar, a language her hands knew by heart. Kneading the dough, feeling it come alive under her palms, was a comfort. The rhythmic push and pull was a kind of prayer. As the bread baked, a warm, yeasty smell began to fill the cold corners of the house. It was the smell of life, of sustenance, of home. It was an aroma that pushed back against the scent of dust and sorrow. Sadie sat at the big table watching. She had not moved from her post. Her gray eyes followed Anya's every move. When the bread was done, golden and round, Anya placed the loaf on a wooden board on the table. She cut a thick slice. The steam rose from it, carrying the scent of warmth. She put the slice on a small plate and pushed it gently across the table toward the child. She did not speak. She did not smile. She just offered. Sadie looked at the bread. She looked at Anya. Her small face was a mask of caution. She did not touch it. Anya did not pull the plate back. She left it there, a silent offering, and went back to her work. An hour later, when she glanced at the table, the bread was gone. A few crumbs on the plate were the only evidence it had ever been there. It was the first sign of acceptance, a small, crumb-sized victory. The days fell into a quiet rhythm. Anya would rise before the sun, light the stove, and put on a pot of coffee. Caleb would emerge from his room, take a cup without a word, and head out to the barn. He worked from sunup to sundown, a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Anya would clean, cook, and mend. She found a pile of Caleb's work shirts, buttons missing, seams torn. She sat in a rocking chair by the window and stitched them, her needle rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Sadie was her constant shadow. The child followed her from room to room, always a few feet away, her silence a tangible thing. She would sit on the floor and watch Anya sew. She would stand in the doorway and watch Anya stir a pot of stew. She never got too close, but she was always there. One afternoon, while searching for more rags in a chest in the attic, Anya found a collection of old linens, tablecloths, bedsheets, yellowed with age but made of fine, soft cotton. They smelled of lavender and thyme. Among them was a dress, a woman's dress, blue with tiny white flowers. It was worn but well cared for. She held it up. It was the dress of a woman who was loved. She imagined another woman wearing it, a woman with a ready smile and a laugh that filled the house, Sadie's mother. She folded it carefully and put it back, closing the chest with a soft click. But she kept a few of the old torn bed sheets. They were too worn to be used on a bed, but the fabric was strong. She took the sheets out to the porch. Sadie followed, watching from the doorway. Anya sat on the top step and began to tear the sheets into long, thin strips. The sound of the ripping fabric was sharp and definitive in the quiet air. Then she began to braid them. 3 strips at a time, her fingers moving with a practiced grace. She braided strip after strip, tying them together until she had a long, thick rope. It was a slow, meditative process. The sun warmed her back. The wind played with the loose ends of the fabric. Sadie crept closer. She sat on the porch floor a few feet away, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had never seen anything like it. When the rope was long enough, Anya tied a knot in each end to make handles. She stood up. It was a skipping rope, a makeshift toy, created from the ghosts of old linens. She looked at Sadie. The child's eyes were fixed on the rope. Anya held it out, one handle in each hand, and began to swing it in a slow, steady arc. Thump, thump, thump. The rope hit the wooden porch in a soft, rhythmic beat. She didn't try to jump. She just swung it, the motion simple and repetitive. Thump, thump, thump. Sadie's gaze was locked on the rising and falling rope. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, a new sound in her silent world. Anya continued, her expression serene, her movements fluid. She was not performing, she was simply doing. The rope caught on her shoe and she stumbled, catching herself on the porch post. A small, breathy sound escaped her lips. Not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. And then it happened. From the small, still child in the doorway, a sound emerged. It was a strange, rusty noise, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. A little hiccup, and then another. It blossomed into a full, clear, bubbling laugh. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in the oppressive quiet of the house, that it seemed to hang in the air like a bright, impossible bird. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A sound of release. Anya froze, the rope still in her hand. Caleb, who had just come around the side of the house from the barn, stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at his daughter, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Sadie was laughing. Her whole small body shook with it. She pointed at Anya's tangled feet and the forgotten rope, and she laughed until tears streamed down her face. It was the most beautiful sound Caleb had ever heard. He looked at Anya, this quiet, strange woman from a world away. She was looking at Sadie, and on her face was the softest, most gentle smile. It was not a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet, profound relief. The first week was over. A laugh had broken the silence. The laugh did not magically unlock Sadie's voice, but it unlocked something else. It cracked the frozen surface of their lives. The house felt different afterward, lighter. The oppressive silence was replaced by a different kind of quiet, one that held the memory of laughter, the possibility of it happening again. Sadie was no longer just a shadow. She was a presence. She began to venture closer to Anya. She would stand by her side as she kneaded bread, her small fingers sometimes reaching out to tentatively poke the soft dough. She would sit beside Anya on the porch steps, watching her sew, sometimes picking up a scrap of fabric and running it through her fingers. Anya, in turn, began to create a small world for them, a world of silent communication. She would point to a bird in the yard, a vibrant blue jay, and then look at Sadie, raising her eyebrows in a question. Sadie would nod, her eyes bright. Anya started humming. It was an old Russian folk song, a simple, melancholy tune her mother used to sing while hanging laundry. She hummed it as she worked, the melody weaving itself into the fabric of their days. One afternoon, as Anya was humming the tune while washing dishes, she heard a small, breathy sound behind her. She turned. Sadie was sitting at the table, humming the same melody. The notes were not quite right, the rhythm faltering, but the song was unmistakable. It was a perfect echo, a piece of Anya's past now living in the throat of this American child. Anya's heart felt a pang, a sweet ache of connection so intense it almost hurt. She turned back to the sink, her eyes wet, and continued to hum, their two voices a fragile, wordless duet. Caleb watched the slow, quiet miracle unfolding in his house. He remained on the periphery, a silent observer. His grief was a high wall he had built around himself, and he did not know how to dismantle it. But he saw the changes. He saw the way his daughter's eyes now followed Anya, not with suspicion, but with adoration. He saw the color returning to Sadie's cheeks. He noticed the small touches Anya brought to the house, a jar of wildflowers on the table, a brightly colored quilt, one she must have pieced together from scraps, draped over the back of the worn settee. The house was cleaner, warmer. The smell of baking bread and simmering stew had replaced the scent of sorrow. One evening he came in from the barn, tired and smelling of hay and cold air, to find Anya sitting by the fire. The fire itself was a change. He had rarely bothered to light one. She was mending the cracked teacup. She had a small pot of a sticky, resinous glue she must have made herself, and she was applying it to the fine crack with the tip of a feather. Her concentration was absolute. The firelight danced on her dark hair and cast her face in soft shadows. Sadie was asleep on the rug by her feet, one small hand resting on Anya's shoe. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched them. This woman, who had come from so far away, was patiently mending the broken things in his house. The teacup, the silence, his daughter. He felt a stirring in his chest, a feeling he had long since buried. It was gratitude, sharp and painful and overwhelming. He cleared his throat. Anya looked up, her eyes wide in the firelight. He gave a short, stiff nod. "Thank you," he said. The words were gravelly, unused. He was not just thanking her for the mended shirts or the warm meals. He was thanking her for the laughter, for the song, for bringing his daughter back from the gray place she had been lost in. Anya simply looked at him, her expression calm, and then returned her attention to the cup. Her acknowledgement was in the slight, peaceful dip of her head. The single mended line on the porcelain shone in the firelight. It was no longer just a crack. It was a testament to survival. The bond between Anya and Sadie deepened into a rich, unspoken language. Mornings began with a ritual. Anya would go to Sadie's room and gently open the window, letting in the cool morning air and the sound of birds. She would stand there for a moment, looking out, and Sadie from her bed would watch her. It was a silent promise that a new day was beginning. In the evenings, after Sadie was tucked into bed, Anya would return and close the window, shutting out the vast darkness and the lonely cry of the wind. It was a promise of safety. Spring arrived, slowly at first, then with a rush of tender green. The harsh winds softened. The sun felt warmer on the skin. One day, Anya led Sadie out to the barren patch of yard beside the house. The ground was hard and unforgiving. Anya had a spade she had found in the barn. She began to dig, breaking up the compacted earth. It was hard, strenuous work. Her face flushed with exertion. Sadie watched, her brow furrowed. After a while, she picked up a small trowel that lay nearby and began to dig beside Anya, her small movements mimicking the larger ones. They worked together, side by side, turning over the soil, preparing it. A few days later, on a rare trip into town with Caleb, Anya did not stay in the wagon. She followed him into the general store. The whispers followed her, as they always did. The Russian bride doesn't speak a word. She ignored them. She walked to the counter where tins and sacks of seeds were displayed. Her finger traced the labels, her lips moving silently as she tried to decipher the English words. She picked up a small cloth bag. On it was a crude drawing of a large yellow flower. Sunflowers. She looked at Caleb, holding up the bag. It was a question. He looked at the bag, then at her determined face. A long moment passed. Then he nodded and paid the storekeeper. Back at the homestead, she and Sadie planted the seeds. They poked small holes in the newly tilled earth and dropped the seeds in, one by one. Sadie patted the soil down over each seed with the palm of her hand, a gesture of gentle finality. Planting seeds in this barren yard was an act of audacious faith. It was a belief that something beautiful could grow where only dirt and sorrow had been before. Every day, they would go out and check on their garden. Anya would water it, using the mended teacup to scoop water from a pail, a small, careful baptism for each potential life. Sadie would crouch down, her face close to the ground, watching, waiting. For weeks, nothing happened. The patch of dirt remained just a patch of dirt. Caleb would watch them from the porch, a skeptical look on his face. Nothing had ever grown there. Then, one morning, a tiny spear of green pushed its way through the soil. Sadie saw it first. She let out a small gasp and tugged frantically on Anya's skirt, pointing. Anya knelt down. There it was, a small, miraculous sprout. She looked at Sadie, and they shared a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Soon, other sprouts appeared. The patch of dirt became a nursery of small green lives. The sunflowers grew with a fierce determination, their stalks thickening, their leaves unfurling. They seemed to be reaching for the sun, a tangible representation of the hope that had taken root in the quiet house. The summer was warm and golden. The sunflowers grew tall, towering over Sadie, their heavy heads following the path of the sun across the sky. Their bright, cheerful faces transformed the front of the house. It no longer looked tired and sad. It looked like a place where life was happening. Laughter became a more frequent sound. Anya would chase Sadie around the yard, their feet light on the softened earth. She taught Sadie how to make daisy chains, how to press flowers between the pages of a book. They communicated with gestures, with expressions, with a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. Anya would tell Sadie stories with her hands, creating birds that flew and rabbits that hopped. Sadie would watch, captivated, sometimes adding a gesture of her own. Caleb changed too, the transformation slow and subtle. The hard lines around his mouth softened. He began to eat his meals at the table with them, instead of standing by the counter. He would watch Anya and Sadie, and sometimes a small, sad smile would touch his lips. He started talking more, not to Anya, but to Sadie. He would tell her about the horses, about the calf that had been born in the night, about the hawk he had seen circling high above. Sadie would listen, her head cocked, and though she did not answer with words, she would respond with her eyes, with a nod, with a small touch of her hand on his arm. He was learning their language. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, Caleb came and sat on the porch steps next to Anya. Sadie was asleep inside. The sunflowers were dark silhouettes against the fiery sky. They sat in silence for a long time. The crickets had begun their nightly chorus. Her mother, Caleb said suddenly, his voice low. She loved flowers. Tried to make a garden here. Nothing ever grew. He paused, his gaze on the towering sunflowers. She would have liked you. Anya did not know what to say. She could not form the English words for comfort or sympathy. So she did what she knew how to do. She reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm. It was a simple gesture, a touch, a recognition of his pain, of his memory. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, and for the first time, the silence between them was not awkward or empty. It was a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. The wall around him had not crumbled, but he had opened a small gate. Life settled into this new, fragile peace. The three of them had formed a strange, silent constellation. A man healing from a loss, a child finding her way back to the world, and a woman who had built a home out of gestures and patience. The cracked teacup was used every day for Anya's morning tea. The skipping rope was a frequent source of laughter. The sunflowers stood as golden sentinels, a testament to their quiet persistence. The Russian lullaby became the house's official anthem, hummed by both Anya and Sadie as they moved through their days. It seemed as if they had found a way to live in the quiet, to make it a place of comfort and love. But the plains were a place of extremes. The golden warmth of late summer gave way to a sudden, biting autumn. The sky turned a metallic gray. A cold, relentless wind began to blow, stripping the leaves from the cottonwoods, and tearing at the heavy heads of the sunflowers. The wind found its way back into the cracks of the house, whistling a mournful, familiar tune. The warmth of the summer felt like a distant memory, a dream they had all shared. It started with a cough, a small, dry cough from Sadie in the middle of the night. Anya heard it and went to her, tucking the blankets more snugly around her. The next day, the cough was worse, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to shake her small frame. Her cheeks were flushed with an unnatural brightness, and her eyes were glassy. Anya felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She made Sadie a hot drink with honey. She kept her bundled by the fire. But the child's breathing grew more shallow, more labored. The fever began to climb. Caleb was gone. He had taken the wagon 2 days before to drive a small herd of cattle to a railhead 50 miles away. He was not due back for another 2 days. A storm was brewing, the sky dark and bruised. The wind howled around the house like a hungry wolf. They were alone. Anya held Sadie in her lap in the rocking chair, rocking her gently, humming the Russian lullaby. The song that had always soothed the child now seemed to have no effect. Sadie was limp in her arms, her head lolling to one side. Her skin was burning hot to the touch. Anya pressed a cool, damp cloth to her forehead, but it seemed to do nothing. Panic began to claw at the edges of her carefully constructed composure. She had seen this before, in the camps, the fever that came in the night and stole the life from a child's eyes. The memory was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her own husband, his face pale with sickness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, she thought. Not again. Not this child. She looked out the window. The world was a blur of wind and driving rain. The town, the doctor, was miles away. An impossible distance in this weather. But Sadie's breathing was getting worse. It was a thin, whistling sound. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear was a language she understood perfectly. It was universal, and it was telling her she was running out of time. She looked at the sleeping child's face, so pale and still, and a fierce, protective love rose up in her, a force more powerful than her silence, more powerful than her fear of the outside world and its strange, sharp words. She could not lose Sadie. She would not. Her silence was a shield she had carried for years, but it was a shield for herself. It could not protect this child. For Sadie, she would let it fall. For Sadie, she would do anything. A decision, hard and clear, formed in her mind. She wrapped Sadie in the thickest quilt she could find, bundling her up until only her small, flushed face was visible. She carried her to the door, her own body a shield against the blast of cold air as she opened it. The barn was 100 yards away, a terrifying journey through the lashing rain and wind. She pulled her shawl over her head and ran, her feet slipping in the mud, the precious bundle held tight against her chest. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of animals and hay. A horse nickered softly in its stall. She had watched Caleb hitch the horse to the small buckboard 100 times. She had watched his hands move, sure and practiced, with the straps and buckles. Now her own hands were trembling so badly she could barely work the leather. The buckles were stiff, the straps heavy. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Think, she told herself. Just think. She took a deep breath, forcing the image of Caleb's hands into her mind. She worked slowly, deliberately, her frozen fingers fumbling but persistent. Finally, the horse was hitched. She let it out of the barn, the wind tearing at her, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She managed to get Sadie settled on the seat, covering her with another blanket, before climbing up beside her. She took the reins in her hands. She had never driven a horse before. She slapped the reins against its back. "Go!" she whispered, the word a plume of white in the frigid air. The horse, sensing her urgency, lurched forward. The buckboard rattled and bounced over the rutted trail. Anya held the reins in a death grip, her eyes straining to see through the sheeting rain. The world was a maelstrom of gray and brown. The only thing that mattered was the small, warm weight beside her, the sound of that terrible, whistling breath. It felt like an eternity. The journey was a nightmare of mud and fear. But finally, through the gloom, she saw a light. A single golden light in a window. The doctor's house. It was on the edge of town. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She pulled the horse to a stop, its flanks heaving. She didn't bother to tie it. She gathered Sadie into her arms and scrambled down from the buckboard. She ran to the door, her legs shaking with cold and exhaustion. She pounded on the wooden door with her free hand, her fist making a frantic, desperate rhythm. "Please!" she cried out, the word tearing from her throat, raw and unfamiliar. It was a sound wrenched from the deepest part of her, from a place of long-forgotten words. The door opened. A man with gray hair and spectacles stood there, a lamp held high. Dr. Miller. He stared at the wild-eyed woman on his porch, soaked to the bone, clutching a child wrapped in a quilt. Anya looked at him, her face a mask of desperation. The carefully constructed dam of her silence broke, and the words came flooding out, broken and accented, but clear in their terrible urgency. "Help!" she gasped, her voice cracking. "Please, girl, sick, fever, hot, can't breathe, please help." Dr. Miller's eyes widened in understanding. He needed no more explanation. He stepped back, ushering her inside, out of the storm. "Bring her in," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Quickly, lay her here by the fire." Anya stumbled into the warmth of the house, her body trembling uncontrollably. She laid Sadie down on the rug where the doctor indicated. He was already kneeling beside the child, unwrapping the wet quilt, his skilled hands moving swiftly, checking her pulse, listening to her chest. Anya stood over them, her hands twisted together, water dripping from her hair and clothes onto the floor. She had spoken. She had broken her long vow of silence. She had used the strange, foreign words to plead for the life of this child who was not hers by blood, but was hers by every other measure. The doctor worked for what felt like hours. He gave Sadie medicine, bathed her in cool water to bring the fever down, and sat with her, listening to every ragged breath. Anya did not move from her spot. She watched, her heart in her throat, her entire being focused on the small, fragile life on the floor. Caleb arrived sometime in the deep of the night, his face a mask of terror. He had gotten back early, seen the empty house, the missing horse, and had ridden like a madman into town, his first thought the doctor. He burst into the room and stopped, taking in the scene. Anya, drenched and pale, the doctor working over his daughter. He rushed to Sadie's side, his hand going to her forehead. "What happened?" he asked, his voice choked. Dr. Miller looked up. "Pneumonia, a bad case. If she hadn't gotten here when she did..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He looked over at Anya, who stood like a statue in the corner. "This woman," he said to Caleb, his voice filled with respect, "she saved her life. She brought her through that storm. I've never seen anything like it." Caleb looked at Anya. He saw not a fragile mail-order bride, but a warrior. He saw the fierce love in her exhausted eyes. He saw the sacrifice she had made, a sacrifice he was only just beginning to understand. He opened his mouth to speak, to thank her, but no words seemed adequate. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze was a world of gratitude, of awe, of a love he hadn't known he was capable of feeling again. The fever broke just before dawn. Sadie's breathing eased and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. The crisis had passed. Anya, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion, sank into a chair by the fire, her watch finally over. They returned home the next day, the storm having passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Sadie was weak but recovering. She sat nestled between Caleb and Anya in the buckboard, her small hand holding tight to a fold of Anya's dress. When they got back to the house, the first thing they saw were the sunflowers. The storm had battered them. Many were broken, their heavy heads hanging low. But some still stood, their faces turned toward the weak morning sun. They were survivors, just like them. In the days that followed, a new quiet settled over the house. It was not the silence of grief, nor the silence of shyness. It was a silence of deep, unbreakable peace. Anya returned to her quiet ways. The torrent of English words she had unleashed at the doctor's door had receded, leaving behind the calm, steady rhythm of her actions. She had used the words when they were needed, a key to unlock a door, to save a life. Now, the door was open. There was no need to shout anymore. She didn't say much after that, but Sadie never left her side again.